I knew something was wrong before I even killed the engine, because nobody parks sideways across a private gravel driveway unless they're trying to send a message. And sitting there, under the bright Colorado mountain sun, was a silver SUV stretched from one edge of my entrance to the other like it had every right in the world to be there. The kind of move that doesn't just inconvenience you. It tells you somebody believes your property belongs to them for the day. I have been looking forward to that weekend for almost a month. Just me, my old lake cabin outside Pine Hollow, a fishing rod leaning against the porch, a cooler full of groceries, and enough silence to wash away weeks of dealing with customers and deadlines back in town. But before I could even shift the truck into park, the driver's door flew open and out stepped Diane Mercer, clipboard tucked under one arm, sunglasses perched on her head, walking toward me with the confidence of someone who had mistaken authority for ownership a long time ago. "You're going to have to leave," she said before I even rolled my window all the way down. "This property is under HOA inspection today." I looked around, then back at her, wondering if maybe I'd missed something in my email. But I already knew I hadn't because I actually read every notice they sent, every agenda, every board meeting summary, every amendment they voted on. Mostly because I'd learned years earlier that paperwork usually matters more than loud voices. "That's strange," I said, climbing out of the truck. "I don't remember approving any inspection." She crossed her arms and smiled, that tight little smile that never reached her eyes. "You don't have to approve it. I'm the compliance coordinator." Now, technically that title sounded impressive, except our community didn't actually have a compliance coordinator. Diane had simply volunteered herself into the role after convincing a few board members she could help keep the neighborhood standards high. And somewhere along the way she'd started believing that meant she could tell everyone else how to live. I'd heard stories before I ever met her. Complaints about flower beds measured with rulers, warning letters over mailbox colors that weren't even prohibited, arguments over flag sizes, trash cans left out 30 minutes too long, little things that somehow became personal crusades, and every story ended the same way. People sighed, paid whatever fine was easier than fighting, then quietly hoped Diane would find someone else to bother next. I guess eventually my turn came. It hadn't started with the driveway either. About 6 months earlier, she walked onto my property without asking because she claimed one of my pine trees might cast too much shade onto a neighboring lot someday. Then she photographed my utility trailer because she insisted it violated community appearance standards even though it was parked behind my barn where nobody but squirrels could see it. Then she complained that my porch light was too bright, then that my fishing boat looked abandoned despite the fact I'd used it that very weekend. Every encounter ending with the same disappointed expression when I politely asked her to show me exactly where the rule existed. Diane hated questions because questions required answers, and answers required facts. Facts had never been her strongest tool. She preferred confidence. Unfortunately for her, confidence doesn't change property records. "I'm going to need you to move your truck and leave until we're finished," she continued, tapping the clipboard with one finger like a judge preparing to hand down a sentence. "How long will that take?" I asked. "However long I decide it takes." There it was. Not a policy, not a regulation, not even the HOA talking. Just Diane enjoying the feeling of deciding somebody else's day. I almost laughed because if she'd simply asked me for 5 minutes, I'd probably have given her 10. But there was something about the way she carried herself that morning. The assumption that my cabin, my driveway, my weekend, all belonged to her schedule. That flipped a little switch in my mind. My father used to tell me that the fastest way to lose an argument was to start acting angry before the other person finished making mistakes. I'm standing there watching Diane. I realized she hadn't finished making hers yet, so instead of arguing, I nodded once, glanced toward my equipment shed, and said, "Well, if I can't drive through my driveway, I suppose I'll work on it instead." She frowned as though she hadn't heard me correctly. I walked past her without another word, unlocked the shed, and pulled back the big sliding door, revealing the old green tractor I'd restored with my dad years before he passed away, still running like a clock despite looking older than half the houses in the subdivision. I climbed into the seat, turned the key, and the diesel engine came alive with that deep, familiar rumble echoing through the pines. And for the first time since I'd arrived, Diane looked genuinely uncertain because she had expected an argument, maybe yelling, maybe threats, maybe a chance to call someone and claim she felt intimidated. What she hadn't expected was a man calmly deciding to spend his Saturday improving his own property. As I eased the tractor toward the section of ground beside my driveway, where I'd already marked utility flags earlier that week for a planned trench, I noticed her reaching for her phone, then looking from the tractor to the SUV and back again. suddenly realizing she might have stepped into a situation she didn't fully understand. And that was exactly when the morning stopped being about who could shout the loudest and started becoming about who had prepared the better story. The funny thing about people who build their confidence on borrowed authority is that the moment something happens outside their script, they start unraveling faster than they ever imagined. And that was exactly what I watched happen as I lowered the tractor bucket, eased forward a few feet, and began shaving a thin layer of dirt from the edge of my own driveway where I'd already planned to install a new electrical conduit before winter arrived. There wasn't anything dramatic about what I was doing. No dirt flying at her SUV, no engine revving in anger, no threats, no gestures, just slow, careful work. The kind my father taught me years ago when he used to say that if you rush equipment, the equipment always wins. Diane, however, looked like she had just witnessed the beginning of a natural disaster. "Stop," she yelled, waving both arms now instead of the clipboard. "You can't operate heavy machinery during an HOA inspection." I pulled the tractor into neutral, leaned slightly out the window, and smiled. "Actually, Diane, I can. This is my property, not lawn conducting official business." "What official business?" I asked. She hesitated for just a fraction of a second. And in arguments like these, hesitation is often where the truth first peeks through. "Community compliance," she answered, sounding less certain than before. "Interesting," I replied. "Could you remind me which section of the bylaws authorizes you to block private access?" Her jaw tightened. She didn't answer because she couldn't. Instead, she pulled out her phone and stepped away, speaking loudly enough that I could hear every other word. "Yes, unsafe. Refusing instructions. Operating machinery. Possible property damage." I couldn't help smiling to myself because I recognized that tone. It wasn't someone reporting facts. It was someone trying to shape a story before anyone else arrived. The problem for Diane was that my version of the story had started 3 days earlier. When I'd scheduled the trench work, I'd emailed the HOA management office as a courtesy, attaching the county utility markings, copies of my contractor permit, photographs of the planned work area, and even a satellite image showing exactly where the conduit would run. I didn't have to send any of that, but years in construction had taught me that documentation is cheaper than litigation. While Diane was still talking on her phone, I continued working, carving a neat, shallow trench exactly where the survey sticks indicated, occasionally stopping to check measurements, completely ignoring the dramatic size and exaggerated pacing happening 20 feet away. 10 minutes later, another pickup rolled into view, this one belonging to my next-door neighbor, Carl Whitaker, a retired firefighter who had lived beside the lake even longer than I had. He parked well off the road, stepped out carrying his coffee mug, looked from Diane to me, then simply asked, "Morning, Ethan. Everything all right?" I shrugged. "Seems I've got a surprise inspection." Carl raised one eyebrow toward Diane. "Inspection of what?" "His property," she answered before I could speak. Carl looked genuinely confused. "Since when does the HOA inspect private driveways?" Diane didn't even acknowledge the question. Instead, she pointed toward my tractor. "He's creating a dangerous situation." Carl looked at the perfectly straight trench, then at the orange utility flags, then back at her. "Looks like he's digging exactly where he marked it last week." That little sentence landed harder than any accusation could have, because now there was a witness confirming that none of this was spontaneous. Diane suddenly realized other people had been paying attention long before today. She immediately changed directions. "Well, Malfershal Luban, he shouldn't be doing it while I'm here." Carl chuckled into his coffee. "Ma'am, maybe you shouldn't be here." I merely laughed out loud, but I kept the tractor idling and said nothing. Silence, I've learned, often encourages people to reveal far more than questions ever do. 5 minutes later, another vehicle appeared. This time, the white SUV belonging to Blue Ridge Community Management, the company our HOA hired to handle records, finances, and legal compliance. Out stepped Daniel Harper, the regional property manager, a man in his early 50s with the permanently tired expression of someone who spent most of his career settling arguments he never started. The moment he climbed out, he noticed my tractor, Diane's SUV blocking the driveway, Carl standing nearby, and the expression on Daniel's face immediately suggested he already suspected exactly how this morning had unfolded. "Morning, everyone," he said calmly. "What's going on?" Diane walked toward him so quickly she almost reached him before he'd shut his door. "Daniel, thank goodness you're here. He's refusing an HOA inspection and operating heavy equipment in an unsafe manner." Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at me. "Morning, Ethan. Morning, everything all right? Doing exactly what I emailed you about Tuesday." He nodded slowly. That's what I thought. Diane blinked. What do you mean? Daniel reached into his truck, pulled out a folder, and flipped through several papers before stopping at a printed email. Mr. Brooks informed us 72 hours ago that he would begin utility trench work today. Here's the permit. Here's the county locate confirmation. Here's the site map. Diane stared the pages without speaking. Daniel looked toward the SUVs still blocking my entrance. Can someone explain why the driveway is obstructed? Diane answered quickly. I blocked it so he couldn't interfere with my inspection. Daniel looked genuinely puzzled now. What inspection? The compliance inspection. There isn't one scheduled. She folded her arms. I scheduled what? Daniel shook his head almost gently, like a teacher correcting a student who had become too confident in the wrong answer. You can't schedule inspections independently. Board approval is required. Written notice is required. Owner notification is required. None of those things happened. For the first time that morning, Diane didn't seem angry. She seemed nervous. Well, I believed. Daniel interrupted politely. Believing isn't the same as authorization. The silence that followed felt almost physical. Even the wind seemed to settle. Then Daniel walked over to the driveway, glanced at the county property markers embedded in the gravel, and said words that would end up changing everything. This entire driveway sits inside Mr. Brooks' recorded property boundary. It is not HOA common property. Blocking access without legal authority creates liability. Carl quietly whistled under his breath. Diane's face lost color. I was trying to enforce the rules. Daniel nodded. Which rules? Again, silence. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the letters she'd mailed to elderly neighbors over flower pots. The argument she'd started with young families over bicycles left in front yards for an afternoon. The widower she reduced to tears because his American flag bracket wasn't mounted at the approved angle. This wasn't one mistake. It was a pattern finally colliding with someone who kept records instead of losing his temper. Just when it seemed the morning might quietly end there, another patrol truck rolled up, responding to the emergency services call Diane had placed earlier. Deputy Mason Alvarez stepped out, adjusted his hat, listened patiently while Diane explained that she feared for her safety because I was operating heavy equipment, then spent less than 2 minutes looking around before asking me a single question. Sir, have you threatened anyone today? No. Deputy, have you left your marked work area? No. Sir. He nodded, walked over to Daniel, quietly reviewed the paperwork, then returned to Diane. Ma'am, operating equipment on private property isn't a crime. Blocking someone's legal access could become one if they choose to pursue it. You could almost hear the air leave her lungs. Suddenly, the confident woman who had greeted me less than an hour earlier was nowhere to be found. In her place stood someone realizing that every dramatic decision she'd made that morning had been witnessed, documented, and confirmed by people she couldn't intimidate. Daniel finally spoke again. Still calm, still respectful. Diane, I'd recommend moving your vehicle immediately. She looked around as if hoping someone would defend her. Nobody did. Carl took another sip of coffee. Deputy Alvarez waited patiently. I rested one hand on the steering wheel of the tractor without saying a word. After nearly a minute, she climbed into her SUV, started the engine, backed slowly off my driveway, and disappeared down the road without another sentence. I watched until the dust settled, lowered the bucket once more, and quietly returned to digging. But somehow, I already knew this wasn't actually the end of the story, because people who spend years building power through intimidation rarely walk away after losing it once. And deep down, I suspected Diane was about to make one final mistake that would affect far more than a single Saturday at the lake. The next Thursday, the HOA board held its monthly meeting in the little clubhouse overlooking the lake. And if you'd asked me that morning whether I planned to attend, I probably would have said no because I had no interest in turning one unpleasant Saturday into neighborhood entertainment. But around lunchtime, Daniel called and said, Ethan, I think you should be there. Not because we need you to argue, but because the board deserves to hear what actually happened from the person who lived it. That sounded fair enough, so that evening I walked in wearing the same work boots I had had on all week, grabbed a seat near the back, and watched neighbors quietly file into the room. There was an unusual energy in the air, the kind you feel when everyone already knows something happened but nobody is quite sure how the story ends. Diane arrived a few minutes later carrying the same clipboard she'd brought to my driveway, although somehow it didn't seem nearly as powerful under fluorescent lights. The meeting moved through its usual agenda first: landscaping contracts, road maintenance, next year's budget. Then the board president cleared his throat and said, "Before we adjourn, we have one compliance matter to review." The room became completely still. Daniel stood, connected his laptop to the projector, and without adding a single dramatic comment simply displayed a timeline. Tuesday, my email notifying management about scheduled trench work. Wednesday, confirmation from the county utility service. Saturday morning, bell, photographs showing the driveway before I arrived. Security camera footage from my cabin showing Diane's SUV pulling across the entrance. Timestamps, property surveys, copies of HOA bylaws, county parcel maps. Then finally the video from my porch camera, crystal clear, showing every minute from the moment I drove up until she finally backed away. Nobody interrupted because there wasn't anything left to speculate about. Facts have a strange way of making loud opinions suddenly become very quiet. When the video ended, one of the board members, an older woman named Margaret Ellis, looked toward Diane and asked gently, "Did you receive authorization from this board before conducting an inspection?" Diane stared at the table for several long seconds before answering, "No. Did anyone instruct you to block Mr. Brooks' driveway?" "No. Did you know the driveway was private property?" Another pause. I assumed. Margaret interrupted softly. "We're asking what you knew." Diane lowered her eyes. "No." The silence after that answer felt heavier than any shouting match ever could have. Then something happened that I honestly hadn't expected. One by one, neighbors began standing up, not to attack Diane, but to describe experiences they'd never felt comfortable sharing before. An elderly couple talked about receiving repeated violation letters over a garden bench that had been approved years earlier. A young family described being threatened with fines because children's bicycles had been left outside after dinner. Carl stood and calmly recalled watching Diane enter other people's property without permission more than once. None of them sounded angry anymore. Mostly they sounded tired. It became painfully clear that what happened at my driveway wasn't an isolated incident. It was simply the first time someone had answered confidence with documentation instead of frustration. After nearly an hour of discussion, the board voted to remove Diane from every volunteer compliance responsibility, revoke her authority to represent the HOA in any capacity, and establish a written policy requiring board approval and management oversight before any future property inspections could even be scheduled. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. It wasn't that kind of victory. It felt more like watching a storm finally move beyond the mountains after hanging over the valley for far too long. As the meeting ended, people gathered in small conversations around the parking lot. A few neighbors walked over to shake my hand. One older gentleman smiled and said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. "You know, you didn't beat her because you were tougher. You beat the situation because you stayed calmer than she expected." I thanked him, climbed into my truck, and drove back toward the cabin just as the last light of sunset settled across the water. The trench had already been filled, the conduit installed, fresh gravel spread neatly across the driveway, and standing there on the porch with a cup of coffee, listening to nothing but the wind moving through the pine trees, I realized the real reward had never been watching someone lose authority. It was knowing I hadn't needed to lose myself to protect what was mine. My father had been right all those years ago. Anger usually wants an audience. Patience usually wins the case. Every now and then someone asks whether Diane ever apologized. The answer is no. We still wave if we happen to pass each other. Nothing more, nothing less. Maybe she believes she was misunderstood. Maybe she still thinks she was trying to help. I honestly don't know. And after everything that happened, I realized I don't really need to know. Some stories don't end with forgiveness because both sides suddenly agree. Sometimes they end when healthy boundaries finally replace unnecessary conflict. Looking back now, I almost feel grateful the whole thing happened because it reminded an entire community that rules exist to serve neighbors, not control them, and that respect can never be enforced through intimidation. So now I'd like to hear from you. If you had pulled us to your own property and found someone blocking your driveway while claiming they had authority they didn't actually possess, what would you have done? Would you have confronted them immediately, called law enforcement, or handled it the way I did by staying calm, documenting everything, and letting the facts speak for themselves? Share your thoughts down in the comments, because these situations are rarely as simple as they first appear, and some of the best conversations happen when reasonable people see the same story from different perspectives. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next real-life property dispute where patience, preparation, and a little common sense end up making all the difference.